This is Mae Brussell, and it is tape number 852, April the 4th, 1988. The top story of the past week, of course, has been the resignations in the Justice Department of 6 people after they failed to oust Attorney General Edwin Meese. A large article was printed in the San Jose Mercury. Top justice officials quit posts. And this kind of story did make all the wire services and talk shows. It had to do with those people that preferred to leave the Justice Department rather than to deal with what is going on under Edwin Meese, and what is going on has also been shared in the newspaper for a long, long time. The number 2 man in the Justice, Deputy Attorney General Arnold Burns, left the department, and the Criminal Division head William Weld also left, and Weld's aides Mark Robinson and Jane Serene left, and Burns' aides Randy Levine and Boykin Rose left the Justice Department. Now, at the time that Edwin Meese was nominated to be Attorney General, I did quite a few broadcasts on that subject. For those of you who don't have the tapes, they're available. Those of you that have them, I'll remind you which ones. Number 639, March 7th, 1984, 641, March 19th, 1984, and 643, April the 2nd, 1984. I updated those during the past 4 years when it was appropriate, and given a certain amount of time to talk about Ed Meese, I could be doing that almost every hour of the week. But I went into the details of Ed Meese's corruption just through the brief articles that came out at the time, and his links to Operation Chaos, to the FBI COINTEL program, his appointments for important people in the Department of Motor Vehicles, in the Home Savings and Loan, and in the Census Bureau, and Meese's role in helping steal Jimmy Carter's papers so that Reagan could get elected in 1980. This was going on, and by passing all the tests and giving a nice debate in front of Jimmy Carter, Edwin Meese then moved into the White House and became the chief of staff for the president and then Attorney General. I cited a lot of California relations that they had, Meese and Ronald Reagan, the California Mafia, and also various appointments and connections that Meese had that were controversial, involving his friend Dr. Earl Brian, the head of biotech company. $16,000 of Meese's money went to biotech, Brian's long friend, and he was investing in this company that had to do with genetic engineering, genetic testing, and went into a tangled web of the relationship of Ursula Meese and Edwin Meese to Dr. Earl Brian, who was former head of health and welfare under Ronald Reagan in California. And now in the past month, Dr. Earl Brian, as controversial as he is and was, just bought United Press International and can serve the Meeses and the people that he wants through the papers that he prints, articles he prints through the UPI services. As a matter of fact, I mentioned Meese's role in controlling the news media, and now this gentleman from the biotechnology field is the head of one of the major wire services for the United States and for the world. And of course, there's another long article in the LA Times, March 24th, Meese's personal finances being probed by McKay, and it goes into the investments that Meese made. And even though the special prosecutor, James McKay, said he hasn't found any criminal activity so far, there are a lot of suggestions of payback and for contracts that were given, and Meese owns stock, $14,000 worth of stock, in a company called Baby Bell when he eased the court restrictions on that company. And when contracts went to the controversial WedTech Corporation, money came back to Meese's account through what he called was a blind trust. And, of course, his friend Mr. Wallach, the attorney from San Francisco, is the key person into all the financial shenanigans that are going on with the Meeses. And every day there seems to be a new one. In fact, one of the articles referred to it as the Chinese torture of one more drop of water every day. The Wall Street Journal had an editorial titled Ursula Meese and Others, and they tried to compare the problems that are allegedly tied or are tied to Edwin Meese now to the fact that 73 members of the House and Senate have members of their family working in paid jobs for other congressmen. And, of course, this story came out of UPI, the very press service that Dr. Earl Brian bought, the very close associate of the Meeses. And the Wall Street Journal knows better than to put this kind of a story in, because it's a non sequitur that has nothing at all to do with the Meese problem. And Mr. Boschwitz, the senator from Minnesota, came on television this weekend with the same argument, that congressmen need some special investigator to go into their crimes. And the listing of 73 people in the House and Senate whose members of families worked for 73 other senators isn't the point at all. Because if the other senators were giving money back to the person whose family member worked for them, then it would be a subject of interest. If you have the son of one delegate or congressman or wife of one person, like in California, Edith Wilkie, the wife of Representative Don Edwards, works for the Arms Control and Foreign Policy Caucus, and she worked for Congress before her husband's election. If the Arms Control and Foreign Policy Caucus put $70,000 into the account of Congressman Don Edwards, then you would have something which is similar. It's not similar if the relative isn't making an extra profit in what's a blind trust from where their mate or son or daughter is working. But it is a cute trick, and if you can get away with it, the Wall Street Journal knows better. They'll try and get away with it, and so will UPI. Another big controversy regarding Ursula Meese's funds has been exposed in the paper. Ursula Meese job records, so they want to subpoena those. The special prosecutor, because first she was working in 1982, a job gotten for her by the William Moss Institute Foundation in Dallas. That job came after the scandal that Edwin Meese was short of funds, and this job had been procured by a person they knew, the William Moss Institute, that could easily be a CIA front or handout for government fronts. And since 1985, she's been working in Washington, D.C., in what they call the National Capital Chapter of Multiple Sclerosis. And, of course, the money doesn't come from the Multiple Sclerosis Society. It comes from the Bender family, who owns the Blake Construction Company that operates the Bender Foundation. So they've been paying her money, and her job her early job for the William Moss Institute was procured for her by Robert Keith Gray, described in the Washington Post and San Jose Mercury March the 30th. Robert Keith Gray runs a public relations firm that I've talked about before, and Robert Gray worked under Henry Kissinger and George Bush on Task Force 157 with Edwin Wilson, an operation that set up hundreds of dummy fronts under the guise of Navy intelligence, and also was instrumental in playing a role in the murder of Salvador Allende in Chile. Robert Keith Gray was the pal that got Ursula Meese one job at the Moss Institute, and now her money is coming from this multiple sclerosis organization. And the salary was set up by Mr. Wallach. He had a finger in that, as well as in all the other problems that Meese has gone entangled himself in. Another long article in the Washington Post titled, "WedTech Mole Helps Secure Pontoon Project from the Navy." And this has to do with an agent named Richard Ramirez, who worked for Secretary of the Navy John Lehman in 1983. And the powers that be wanted the WedTech Corporation to get the sole Navy contract. And it took a lot of coaxing and telephone calls, but not much if you understand John Lehman's work with the counterintelligence group, his desire to build up this large Navy, his ego inflated by Ronald Reagan. He's very much part of the Henry Kissinger inside team and worked with Northrop and has been a very controversial person himself. So he in the Navy gave the sole contract through the U.S. Rapid Deployment Forces request, and the Navy reversed their position to turn over their program to the Small Business Association, and they gave it solely to another member of the Small Business Association named WedTech, run by a gentleman, Mr. Moreno. And Moreno started working with Ramirez in the fall of '83 and worked through the Washington-based Latin American Manufacturers Association And just to make the whole story short, you know the punchline now. WedTech got the their corporation got the money for this very expensive pontoon for the rapid deployment forces, and it went into WedTech that went bankrupt, and they were paying $30,000 for Ramirez to tell what the Secretary of Navy was doing, where they were meeting, and a spy was paid inside the Navy Department in order for WedTech to get the contract that it did. Now, listener to World Watchers, changing the subject now, lives in Kansas and sent me a long series of articles printed the same day in the Kansas City Times about Satanism and the growing awareness of Satanism and the conferences of various people and organizations throughout the country that are beginning to take this matter seriously. The 2 pages of newspaper that carried these stories had several subtitles. One is called Satanists Classified by the Police, and it has a very large picture, about 4 by 6, of Michael Aquino, page A20, March 26, 1988, and it tells about the different types of Satanism, and then it goes into the religious Satanists, the Church of Satan, and the Temple of Set in San Francisco, and quotes Sandy Gallant from the San Francisco Police Department, and Anton LaVey, who founded the Church of Satan in San Francisco, and it refers to the Satanic Bible, and there's an explanation of the Church of Set, the Temple of Set of Michael Aquino, and his wife Lilith, who are suspects in a child molestation case but haven't been charged, and this is a large part of that article. The next part of the article, which is very, very important, and I've discussed this with several people, has to do with the therapists, the psychologists, psychiatrists, child psychiatrists, adults, people treating adults, and not being aware of the horrors of cult satanic abuse and treating symptoms as being caused by other factors, but are now, thank goodness, rethinking the whole problem of therapy to include victims of Satanism. In this article from the same Kansas City Times, goes into the fact that while police go through physical clues and look for problems of satanic rituals and crimes, they're sending their evidence to therapists, and various therapists are asking or inquiring and getting out of particular patients the fact that they were involved in satanic cults, a fact that has never hardly been in the minds of therapists up until this point. And one person is quoted in this article, Al Sarno, a psychotherapist, who said he had 35 clients who've been involved in satanic cults. Either they were victims of them or they were abusers, and they described rituals, sexual abuse, children being abused, slashing of flesh, urinating, defecating on victims. He worked with more than 100 cases and consulted expert witnesses. In criminal cases, another therapist, Janet Bunker, described and discovered in 1985 that with a little psychological help, she learned from her client that this client and others were victims of sexual abuse, and recalled rituals of satanic cults. And then Janet Bunker said that there were no books to read on this. There was no suggestion of treatment for the trauma, and many of these victims have also been victims of amnesia and brainwashing. Therapists said the victims have developed coping mechanisms to survive. They mentally disassociate themselves from vile acts they committed or witnessed or endured, and therefore develop multiple personalities. Our minds are not prepared to deal with this trauma, to see people cut open, said Daryl Miller, another clinical social worker at the Johnson County Mental Health Center in Kansas. Miller said he has 8 clients who were involved in Satanism, and 3 of the 8 saw human sacrifices where human beings were killed. And this article continues, there's a group called Overcomers Victorious in Garden Grove, California, and they're talking about Satanism beginning with people young at the age of 10 or earlier. And one particular victim of Satanism, Jacques Balodis, said that she had developed more than 100 personalities when she left the cult a few years ago. Now the therapists are looking into the symptoms of satanic ritual abuse, and Pamela Klein, of Chicago, is working as a therapist trying to help victims of these crimes who have been sexually abused and seen murders. And satanic cult conversation comes in these clients starting when they were just 4 years old. And they're now being given clay and plastic to play out what happened, and the therapists are learning, really, for the first time, actually, what went on in these cults and how it affected these people later. And there's quotations in this article about 2.5 years ago, an injection of sodium amytal in a Kansas City hospital and subsequent hypnosis unlocked a mental door that a woman had slammed when she was 12 years old, and what emerged was repeated molestation from the ages of 3 or 9 by male relatives, memories of sexual abuse, and murder committed on Halloween by a satanic cult in Missouri, and black-robed adults and makeup that was ghoulish, and being bitten by snakes and hung upside down over a fire. And during a ceremony, an unknown man was stabbed to death, and those present drained his blood, they drank it, and they ate his flesh, and then the remains were thrown in the fire. And this particular person who went through all this is now a law student at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and the highway patrolmen are looking into her case because she experienced this herself. Another part of that article that took up 2 full pages is about the police attention turning to satanic crimes. In fact, the title of it, Prevalence of Cults Evaded, and it quotes a FBI agent, Ken Lanning, who at times isn't quite sure how bad this is, and is pulling back to totally admit how prevalent the matter is. But the article says, nevertheless, an increasing number of police officers with national and regional reputations for investigating cult-related crimes say the reports have been increasing in the 1980s, particularly among teenagers. Last December, 3 school seniors allegedly beat a classmate to death in Missouri. There were other deaths described, satanic deaths in New Jersey. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker in Los Angeles, was involved with Satanism and the devil, drawing pentagrams on bodies. And the molestation of children in Manhattan Beach McMartin School is mentioned in this article. And then it goes into the police studying the occult. Larry Jones of Boise, Idaho, is going into it. Jones is director of the Cult Crime Impact Network. That's another group of 1,200 law officers looking into this matter. And in Chicago, there is a group looking into the satanic rituals and murders. And in San Francisco, under the auspices of Sandy Gallant, she is lecturing and is active in putting together information on the occult. Also, there is the Cult Awareness Network News, and that is a newsletter that comes out of Chicago, and I have the address for you here. If you want to subscribe, it is $25 a year, and I obtained all the back copies of Cult Awareness News Network, and Cult Awareness Network it's called. And you can send for that if you want and subscribe to it, and then go to the back copies if you want. And this organization describes all kinds of cults, but they just, in their last issue, had some parts about Michael Aquino and the Satanism that is prevalent in San Francisco. And there's a lot in Missouri where Michael Aquino just happens to live with his activity in the Army Reserve. Also, the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit in Quantico, Virginia, is studying sexual victimization of children, survivors of satanic cult abuse. They're coming out of the woodwork. And a Leawood police officer in Kansas is president of the Lost Child Network based in Leawood, and he has a task force of 50 enforcement officers and therapists who begun to discuss the allegations of satanic crime in Kansas City. Then the article continues, there is an urgent need for the mental health community, the local police departments, to check into this problem. And Mr. Miller had 8 clients who had been involved in Satanism, 3 who actually reported the human sacrifice. I mentioned that it was written in this article twice. In recent years, Kansas City area police departments receive reports of animal mutilations, naked people dancing, chanting around fire, cemetery vandalism, all linked to occult groups. But unfortunately, it's gone on a long time before people take it seriously. And I repeat again, I had many articles on murder, satanic murders and rituals, and just had them in my files in some loose form. and didn't realize how prevalent it was and how serious it was and the importance of it going to members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the NATO forces or doing rituals in Himmler's castle. Now, this article tells about investigations against threats against 3 girls who said they were told they would be victims of satanic sacrifice, and I read this past weekend that a large group of children from a town in Missouri, the girls were kept in because they were told a young girl and a virgin would be sacrificed this past weekend, and so the schools were closed because of the fear that this was going to happen. In Kansas, Sergeant Kurt Matthews, who's supervisor of the Missing Persons Unit for Missouri Highway Patrol, said police agencies around the state are investigating reports of ritualistic crimes, some of them satanic, and the Kansas City police are saying that they've heard stories about neighbors who were frightened. They heard screaming, they see a fire, and there were rituals, satanic rituals with a question mark at a place called Longview Farm. A young woman who's a client of a Kansas City psychotherapist said she saw animals and she saw human satanic sacrifices in this farm in the 1960s, and that there was activity in this farm for this purpose, and the sacrificial rituals would last all night, and then they would burn everything up at the end, and what they didn't burn they would bury, and then they would leave it before the sun came up. The law enforcement officers and therapists interviewed have received unverified reports of satanic rituals. The majority of the law enforcement are in no way prepared to handle this kind of information. This is in the article. They don't know what to do with it. Wichita police officers had to take a crash course in satanic crimes after a nude body of a 15-year-old was found face down in the mud. She was stabbed in the throat and chest, hands tied behind her back. Sergeant Hill wants to develop a regional network of law enforcement officers, child abuse investigators, mental health professionals going into Iowa, Nebraska, Missouri, Kansas, Illinois to share information on the occult. It's very good that these people are catching on and sharing and combining their knowledge of the symptoms now of what is happening. And the article, as I say, covers 2 whole pages of the newspaper, and it's very important that I share it with you to see how these slow learners like myself are catching on, and they're in charge of investigations or in the therapy of people with mental problems, and it had never occurred to them to go into these matters. Janet Banker, a local therapist who's been treating cult survivors, said people who have witnessed or been victims of crimes often haven't been taken seriously by the mental health professionals, and also after examining 30 patients in Illinois in the mental institutions, people recounted these crimes, but again, nobody took them seriously, or when they heard about murders, drug rings, child prostitution, pornography, kidnapping, the satanic part was just that little element that was left out. And Mr. Jones of Cult Crime Impact Network said, "It's pandemic. It is so bad." A Mr. Bean said each individual case has to be investigated for criminal activity, not for the religious beliefs of the person, but do they kill? Are they murderers? And then there's some quotations by Maury Terry, who wrote The Ultimate Evil, that said there's a compelling evidence of the existence of a nationwide network of satanic cults, some aligned more closely with others than some are on the fringe of being aligned, and others are very closely aligned. And then Jacques Baladi, who I quoted before, a former satanic cult member who runs Overcomers Victorious, said that she has counseled more than 200 people in the last 8 years that were part of satanic cults, many who escaped only with clothes on their back, and she believed after seeing this many that it's plausible that 50,000 humans each year are sacrificed in satanic rituals. Bodies are never found, again, because they are mutilated, eaten, burned, and buried. That death threat that I got saying you're going to be off the air, period, remember, said that you'll never be found again. You'll be taken off with the head blown off, and nobody will find a trace of you. And this appears over and over, that these missing people, missing children, missing adults, there is not a trace left of them. This person who was part of satanic ritual said, "We did a lot of child sacrifice." She said, "Children who are kidnapped or born into the cult are used for sacrifices, and she claims her first 2 children were among the victims. And this woman was on Oprah Winfrey telling about that, or I forget which one, whether it was Geraldo Rivera, Oprah, talking about these sacrifices and breeding children to be killed. Catherine Gould, a Los Angeles area psychologist, says she gets calls from therapists all over the country, and their problem is they can't get any preschools closed or daycare centers when they think children are being abused, that nobody will prosecute the case, they drop the case, and they don't want to believe the children's stories. She said she's seen 20 children who have been subjected to ritual abuse in the past few years, and she's compiled a list of satanic ritual abuse symptoms that are circulated, and children who have been ritually abused in preschool and child care settings have formed, again, another group, nationwide group called Believe the Children. So there's about 6 active groups right now. Believe the Children is a 300-member group formed in October 1986, and Gould says children can be brainwashed, into the Satanism and the killings and the black magic power that goes with it. FBI agent Mr. Lanning, who's a moderate on the subject, has admitted in this article that too many police officers are taking an all-or-nothing approach to this matter. If they can't prove a murder occurred, they discount the child's entire story. The allegations of a national or international network of Satanism and criminals that work and kidnap children and sacrifice thousands of them is purportedly almost a accepted fact now from reports in San Francisco and other places around the country. If what some of these people are saying is true, this is by far the greatest crime story in the history of man. And that's a quotation from Sandy Gallant in San Francisco. And when you add to that the story of Michael Aquino at Heinrich Himmler's castle, duplicating rituals that the Church of Set does, worshiping Satan and having the swords of the Waffen-SS, the Gestapo, it is truly the greatest crime conspiracy in the history of man, and I believe that these are the factors that wanted me off the air, linking the occult to the military. It is the greatest crime conspiracy. That comes from Sandy Gallant in San Francisco, who knows and knew since 1982 things about Michael Aquino, and nobody would prosecute him. And she refers to a murder in San Francisco, a derelict picked off the street. His killer carved an inverted pentagram in his chest, dripped candle wax on his body, drained his blood, sexually mutilated him, and devoured parts of his body. This is going on in San Francisco. And rumors of sacrifice are taking place in Lucas County in Ohio. The sheriff reported digging up, looking for bodies, and looking for a cult of 200 people stretching from Ohio and Michigan that have been sacrificing 5 persons each year since 1969. I don't know how they come across with that figure unless somebody told them that who participated, but if it's 19 years and you have 5 people a year, that's still 65 bodies approximately, if I add it up fast enough. The humans, and to get those killed every year is enough to scare the other members into obeying and doing what you want. And this article concludes, despite the lack of bodies, Larry Dunn, a Washington state sheriff deputy and member of the Cult Crime Impact Network, is the one who also believes 50,000 sacrifices are reasonable. March the 1st, the FBI had a list of 61 names missing, and Mr. Dunn said he encountered more than 170 survivors of satanic cults, and they reported seeing human sacrifices. So this is a long article, 2 pages. I wanted to share it with you from the Kansas City newspaper about the occult, and it is getting into the Midwest and into the FBI and the consciousness of the therapist. So that's a good start, because you have to have those kinds of breakthrough to recognize the problem. I'll take a 1-second break while we turn the tape over. It's only 30 minutes on each side, and as fast as I do that, I'll continue on side 2 of this tape. This is Mae Brussell, and it is the second half of tape number 852, April the 4th, 1988. I was going to do a lot about the occult. I have so many articles and material and references from books to continue on the occult, which I agree with Sandy Gallant is the #1 crime story of the century. It's even bigger than the assassination of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. It's the next step beyond to the intensive purposes and the network of people doing these things. I have a conflict because each week I want to do more on that material, and then, of course, next week I want to get into George Bush and maybe do a section on George Bush every single week until the elections take place in November of 1988. A friend of mine sent me a section of her husband's library. He passed away, and he studied political science, and she sent me material from his library. And among the things she sent me was a magazine called The World's Work, and it was published by Doubleday, Page and Company, and I don't know how long it was out. The issue that she sent me was July 1918. It's a magazine the size of the National Geographic. It's slick and shiny, and was printed in New York City, L.A., and Chicago by Arthur W. Page, the editor. The World's Work, published in 1918. And in there's a section of small articles. The main lead story is the talk of the office. And under it, it says German plans for world conquest. And this is what these two paragraphs say in this article that came out in the year 1918. A few months ago, The World's Work printed an article by J.B.W. Gardner, pointing out the portentous meaning of events that give clear evidence that Germany is preparing for her next great war. This article created such widespread interest and brought such an avalanche of letters that Mr. Gardner was persuaded to develop the theme of the article further. Therefore, he has written a book, which I'm going to try to get somewhere, on the subject entitled German Plans for the Next War. We rushed into print a few weeks ago copies of this article, the resume of the book, without the usual preliminary announcement and advance sales. In this book, Mr. Gardner presents indisputable proof that Germany, convinced that she cannot attain her aims completely now, is planning a war of world conquest for the next generation. That was really before there was an Adolf Hitler. There was a Hitler who was gassed with mustard gas and went to a hospital and then became part of a mind control program identical to the one that Ronald Reagan had when Patrick Frawley and the powers that be in California decided that he would be the President of the United States. And this intent to rule the world was evident in 1918. And then I have to put this book, obtain it, and put it next to my book, The Nazis Go Underground, by Kurt Reese, and show the plans in 1943 to take over the world the next time by the Germans. And this way, this time they don't even have to have a war. They can undermine us every which way from inside out. And the United States right now is turning around and is behaving the way it would behave if it were victimized and were not the winner of World War II. And I believe strongly that the purpose of all of this occultism brought in by Aleister Crowley from British intelligence, brought in the 40s, just when the war was winding down, was to turn people to Satan and turn them against each other and create the general chaos, the strategy of tension that Stefano Della Calle and the CIA used, that the occult part, the rituals, the killings, the drinking of blood, the vandalism, the cannibalism, eating human beings, is preparing for Germany's control of us within a few more years. The San Francisco Chronicle had two articles about Nancy Reagan and her new house. One was March 29th, and it explains how she bought a house in Bel Air. And, of course, I had that on the program World Watchers about 8 months ago. And Ronald Reagan bought this home because members of an 18-member investment group formed together to buy a home for the President of the United States. Two names are familiar, the early Reagan life, Holmes Tuttle and Earl Jorgensen. But there are 18 people that decide, we will buy the President a home. Now, he's supposed to return gifts over a certain amount. He made money in the movies. His wife had money. Her family were fairly well off. He worked for General Electric. He was a governor 8 years and a president. And I don't know why they can't live on the money that they made and their Social Security that comes and et cetera, et cetera. But I don't know how these people are allowed to have a home handed to them over $2 million. They allegedly will rent it for 3 or 4 years and then have the option to buy it, but it'll be supplied for them. And how come there's not more outrage about the fact that these 18 people should be identified? We hear about Meese getting favors and Ursula Meese getting favors and jobs, and Nancy doesn't have to work because a $2.5 million home is bought for her. And I mentioned, again, about 8 months ago that the address was 666 St. Cloud Road. That's in Bel Air, right near University of California. Well, the Chronicle had a story this week that the First Lady visited the house 666 and the building that is called the Demon House. But because of the biblical mention of the number 666 as the sign of the devil, the Reagans made sure that the address was changed. So they now live at 668 St. Cloud Road. Of course, they have enough influence to change the number on their house so they're not going to be in the devil house. Now, I wanted to run through a few obituaries with you. There's so many that come out every week, and I've been putting 1 or 2 on the air every week, and some of these you might have seen or might not have seen, but I think they're important to what is going on at the present time. One is the long article, Inquiry Urged into 8 Deaths of British Scientists Who Die in Mysterious Ways. Last April the 10th, 1987, the San Francisco Examiner had an article, Mysterious Suicides of Scientists Puzzle British Society, although they hardly look like suicides at all. And 5 of them worked for Marconi Underwater Systems defense contractors. But 8 scientists have died in Great Britain. It sounds very much like Alternative 3. And now they're asking for the investigation because they want to know what is the link between these deaths. The government has pushed aside any investigation. They said there's no evidence to support the idea that these deaths were linked other than coincidence. And yet all of these people are working with the guided missile system, with the Star Wars plans, and for one reason or another, 8 scientists have been killed. I haven't had time to bring to your attention an article I've mentioned a few times about 6 or 8 of the top leading Japanese businessmen dying all at one time last year. And here are 8 scientists in Great Britain. It reminds me of the missing agents and scientists in Alternative 3. And if you think about it, that book was written as nonfiction about the United States and Soviet Union working together on a project on Mars, which we're doing, about how the Earth is too crowded, there's too many people because of the ozone layer pollution, which is happening, and the missing scientists that are used for experimentations. And, of course, in Great Britain, there are 8 scientists missing, and also in Germany, one of the Star Wars scientists was gunned down recently, and also in Italy, the same thing. Another death this past week, the article's titled, Ex-Secretary to Chief of Police Gates in Los Angeles Beaten to Death. Alita Marie Brown, who worked with Chief of Police Daryl Gates for quite a long time, was found with a broken neck and was choked. And she was in Gates' office from April 1981 until November 8th, 1987. And I think of what 2 events would come through Daryl Gates' office that this woman would know about. One, of course, is the murder of John Belushi. There was even some talk or allegations that Daryl Gates' brother had supplied some of the narcotics for Kathy Smith, who then killed John Belushi, and Daryl Gates' own son was arrested on narcotic charges. And also the big story is the story of the organization called Western Goals, with its headquarters in Los Angeles, and a $100,000 computer that was shared with Los Angeles Police Department, Jay Paul and Daryl Gates. And that event has been very much hushed up, considering the meaning of this organization having a direct link to the police department. And then when Larry McDonald died on the Korean airline, he was chairman of Western Goals. The chairmanship went to Carl Spitz-Channel, who was the first person to plead guilty to the Iran-Contra affair. And so this personal secretary of Gates would certainly have knowledge of Western Goals and the John Belushi case. There's an article about a policeman in Miami Herald. He's called a former policeman because he murdered 9 people. He was perfectly normal until he murdered 9. He said he wanted to get rid of the world of evil, and he murdered them, and they were involved in drug trade, and he had to clean up the world and get rid of these people. the important thing about this policeman who killed 9 people, he was a former highway patrolman, a Boy Scout leader. He was decorated in the Navy. He had to file a full record of commendations. He once had a file, rather, on commendations from the military. And he's been accused of this killing rampage. Among other things, in his apartment was a camera and pictures of the victims, but also a collection of Nazi memorabilia. He was a Nazi American, and he even had a Doberman Pinscher with a swastika on his leg. This kind of person who wants to rid the world of these ugly people, he has to get rid of them, is typical of the Nazi mentality, where selected people were offed very early in the period just before Adolf Hitler was officially elected in Germany. So this former policeman, Eagle Scout, was getting rid of people, 9 people. Another untimely death for a member of Congress, the story prominent lawmaker in the House of Representatives dies at age 60. This is Representative John Howard of New Jersey, the influential chairman of the House Public Work and Transportation Committee. He was a member of the House for 22 years, and he died of a heart attack out on the golf course and just passed away. There's a quotation in the Kansas City Times again. Democratic Senator Edward Kennedy said, "Jim's always said he was inspired by President Kennedy to enter public service, and he was one of the most efficient and effective, loyal supporters that John and Robert Kennedy and I ever had. He was instrumental in passing a Clean Air and Clean Water Act, and he fought to end pollution on the coast of New Jersey." Now, New Jersey has been involved with a lot of mafia contracts to get rid of pollution that they were dumping into the water. So if he was ending pollution in New Jersey, he was rubbing shoulders with a lot of mafia who intended to pollute. Last week I talked about Native American Julian Pierce in North Carolina, who was running for a political office as a candidate for the Supreme Court judge in North Carolina. He formerly worked with the Security Exchange Commission. He got death threats from the Ku Klux Klan before he was killed. They told him they were going to kill him. But, of course, the law enforcement agent investigating his murder, Sheriff Hubert Stone, an antagonist against the American Indian movement, solved the crime within a few days. I just had on the air, and the next day the crime was solved. Another American Indian was charged with the crime. That Indian commits suicide, sort of like killing Lee Harvey Oswald and not knowing if he killed John Kennedy or not, which later turned out he didn't do. So this very important American Indian attorney who has been trying to fight all kinds of racism and oppression in his hometowns was threatened to be killed by the Klan and was killed. That's the third article in 3 weeks that I have cited where a person was threatened to be killed and was killed. A lot of people told me when I got the death threat that people who threaten don't mean it, but I could cite 1 article a week or 10 if you have the time. And, in fact, people who threaten to kill do often kill. And so here is the Klan killing this Indian leader. And remember the SLA murder, some of you don't, of Dr. Marcus Foster, the black man in California who was killed. And he was warned by the Nazi Party out in San Leandro, California, he would be killed. And, yes, indeed, he was killed. So people make threats and people do it. And that's why I took the threat seriously. Now, a landmark case came down this past week in terms of legal opinions that can affect a lot of what happens in the future in terms of murders and death penalties that is really scary. The San Francisco State Supreme Court that meets in San Francisco unanimously overturned the death sentence of a man, Mr. Lucero, who killed a little boy, 7 years old. Chris was 7 and Teddy was 10. He put their bodies in a trash bin, and he was supposed to get the death penalty. And in California, they got rid of the Supreme Court chief, Rose Bird, because they thought she was too soft on the death penalty. And, of course, when a decision comes along, it's reversed for other people for the same reason she was accused of being soft. Now, the important part about this case is that the person who did the murders was a Vietnam veteran. And his argument was that he had a psychological disorder caused by post-traumatic stress, and that he shouldn't be given the gas chamber because the military had taught him to kill. The Vietnam stress had caused the murder, and that he may be experiencing traumatic incidents and flashbacks. Now, the defense argued no death penalty because he was a Vietnam veteran. A lot of the paramilitary that have committed terrible crimes and a lot of the activity with satanic rituals, and such as David Berkowitz, who was over in Vietnam when he got into the satanic group, he can come home and say, I was trained in the military, and therefore I'm not guilty. David Berkowitz didn't get the death penalty, but this sets the precedent for Vietnam veterans who are very, very violent to do murders and get off, or somewhat get off, not completely, because they've been to Vietnam and been taught to kill, and this argument says society taught them to kill. So we may see many of these gun-ho Vietnam veterans getting off of hard sentences or sentences on this very historic landmark case of society teaching him to kill. There is another person in Paris who died a very untimely, quick death, who was linked to the Iran arms connection, and his name was Ralph M. Broman, B-R-O-M-A-N, a Colonel Ralph Broman, nicknamed Bud. He's a black officer who was stationed in the American Embassy in Paris, and it was Mr. Broman who was given the order from whoever higher up that was at the meetings to tell the Pentagon at home to start sending the TOW missiles to Iran. And his contact in the Pentagon was General Colin Powell, who was promoted to be head of the national security. And this Mr. Broman ordered the missiles on instructions from Americans in Paris to the Pentagon. And after the instructions went out, he formally left the service. He became a former member of the Army, and he formed a shipping line, Ralph Broman, and he was shipping weapons to Iran through the shipping line and transferred from the embassy in Paris to an ordinary citizen in a business shipping arms to Iran. He was married to the daughter of the head of French intelligence, and I mentioned the role of Mr. Desmarenches, the French intelligence chief, who was advising Ronald Reagan about such things as World War III and how to produce enough activity to create a excuse for World War III to begin, and also the death of Glenn Suham in Paris, a gentleman who was instrumental in getting a shipment of arms, at least one, from Poland through France, and then down. It was supposed to go to the Contras and was held back by Noriega in Panama to check out where the weapons were going or to torture the Americans. And Glenn Suham was gunned down in Paris, and his father was in the State Department in the White House the very day that he was being killed in Paris, and he worked for the National Security Council. So Mr. Broman, Colonel Bud Broman, is another person linked to the arms to Iran and the Iran Gate scandal, who was instrumental in giving the go-ahead to ship those arms for after meetings in Paris. Many of you might have seen a story. Washington Post had a long item, some of the papers didn't carry it, titled Environmental Protection Agency Stops the Use of Nazi Human Tests. Washington Post, and this was March 24th. The article says that the Environmental Protection Agency was going to be using tests approved by John Vandenberg of the EPA for a gas called phosgene, Phosgene. This gas was used as part of Nazi experiments at prisoner war camps in Strasbourg and in France. And the people at the EPA, Mr. Vandenberg, and a company called Clement Associates in Washington, thought it was very good to use the Nazi gases that were experimented on Jews and prisoners for finding out what poison gases do or how to build up a resistance to them. That's the excuse for doing that. But then some other people caught on to what was happening. A Judith Bellin, an EPA toxicologist, attended a forum, and she noticed that the charts were made out of the effects of prisoners of war, that they came through scientific discussions of the Nazis. She said it is unethical, that these weren't really scientifically done. A good scientist wouldn't use this Nazi work. It was described as a piece of crap. And the researchers and scientists got together and decided they wouldn't use the Nazi experiments for American scientific papers Dr. Robert J. Lifton, a psychiatrist and expert on Nazi medical experiments, said that once in a while the data is occasionally discussed today, but he knows of no cases where this was the basis for scientific evaluation. Now, after I read that, I was thinking about the poison gas that Iraq used to put on the Kurds and to test them. That's right in their own area. To at least 5,000 people died. And there was a series of articles this past week, one titled Gas Victims Flown to Europe, March 30th, 1988, San Jose Mercury. 24 Kurds burned on hands and face and backs were attacked with poison gas. They were flown to Vienna, Austria, to West Germany, to Great Britain, and Switzerland, where the testing of, or curing, in quotes, curing these young people being sent to Europe away from Iraq and Iran, they could work on them and see the effect of cyanide and mustard gas bombs used to kill so many. And a Dr. Freilinger, department head of Vienna's University for plastic surgery, will be working with these people injured in mustard gas and the combination of light nerve gas causing headaches and dizziness and burning the lungs and so forth. So the countries that used poison gases to experiment on human beings are now treating the victims of poison gas, and the poison gas was supplied by France and Western countries for these horrible burnings that took place, and maybe they're allowed so that they can use these people who are victims to experiment on the environment or the testing. They don't have to give gas to people to test it afterwards. That would look as bad as Nazi Germany, but you could drop the bombs and then fly the victims to Vienna and Germany, Switzerland, and England to work up the studies afterwards. There was a long article in the Washington Post, March 17, 1985, about a book that was written called Flowering of the Bamboo. I might have mentioned it 3 years ago on World Watchers a long time ago, and this has to do with a well-known person, a Japanese prisoner who was put into the prison and charged with a crime that he didn't do, and he was held for 30 years, and he was convicted for mass murders in 1948, and he said he didn't do that. He said that the Americans were fearful of the exposure of a secret experiment unit the Japanese were doing with and the United States used that information, and that he could be privy to it, and that they put him in jail to cover up for the experimentations that were taking place. He said after the war, the United States granted members of the Japanese unit immunity from war crime prosecution in return for data from their experiments. This did not become generally known in Japan until 1970s, when the newspapers wrote extensively on the subject. Mr. Hirasawa's supporters have contended that the Americans didn't want those operations exposed, so they charged him with some of the medical failures or deaths and put this man in jail. He, in 1948, went to prison. He was convicted of a bank incident at which time people would be exposed. In the afternoon, a man posing as a health inspector entered a Tokyo branch of the bank and tricked 16 employees into drinking a poison and told them it was a medicine to prevent an epidemic, and the man fled with some money. People were left on the floor breathing, and 12 of them died, and he said that this was part of an experiment and that he was convicted, and it's written up in a book called Flowering of the Bamboo, published by Woodbine House, a Washington publisher, on the United States and the Japanese working together, the Japanese Army Chemical Laboratory, where experiments took place. The shocking thing about those experiments was also written in another book, and the person who wanted to use the research of the Japanese experiments was none other than Mr. Charles Willoughby, the chief of intelligence for General Douglas MacArthur's staff, and I know I've done many broadcasts on Willoughby, and he found out about Japanese germ warfare that continued in Japan after the war, and it had secret funding from the American government. This article came out in the London Observer, August 21st, 1983, 5 years ago. Prisoners, babies, mental patients were used for experimentation, and former members of the Japanese germ warfare unit in Manchuria, Unit 731, just met along with the American 406th Division, part of the occupation force, and the Americans knew that the Japanese were experimenting on these people, and under a department called Infectious Diseases Department in Tokyo, and it combined the work of the experiments in Manchuria, and then after the war, and the Americans used their experiments. And Charles Willoughby thought and wrote up an article that it would be beneficial for the Americans to use the effect of the Japanese experiences. They were actually freezing people in their limbs, freezing them alive, and testing the effect of freezing on them to a certain point, shooting into their frozen limbs, and testing them for typhoid and organisms and poison, drinking water and food. And Mr. Willoughby, his name is Karl Wiedenbach, a member of Hitler's school, the Berlin School of War, the the Kriegsakademie. The Freikorps were the young Nazis that were killing until they became the police department when Hitler came in office in 1933. He was part of the Kriegsakademie, the Berlin Academy for War, and Willoughby was a founding member of Young Americans for Freedom, put together by William Buckley and Douglas Caddy, and on the board, sharing an honor with Willoughby, was Ronald Reagan, whose background goes way back to those fascist days, Willoughby and the experimentations and so forth. A book called Devil's Brigade came out on this subject, and I talked about that in 1983. The Devil's Brigade is about the experiments in Harbin and the use of the Americans wanting to employ the techniques that the Japanese used for killing thousands. And this is another book on the Harbin germ factory, and instead of trying the Japanese for war crimes and experimentations, we used their material and joined with them. And of course, you know, Dr. Joseph Mengele, who did these experiments, and all the other doctors who did the experiments were never tried as war criminals in Nuremberg, and one reason is that we wanted to use the expertise of their work and use it for future use, which we probably are doing now continuously, benefiting. In the EPA just this past month, a few weeks ago, was using the Nazi experiments for studies on germ warfare. And finally, to conclude this broadcast, 852, Spotlight magazine, published by Willie Cardo, has a picture of James Bo Gritz with David Duke. And the article says that Bo Gritz, the man that we've talked about on these broadcasts, has been revealing the narcotics connections to higher-ups in Washington, is going to run as vice president under David Duke. Now, some of you don't know the name David Duke of Louisiana. He was formerly the Grand Wizard of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, of all the Klan in the United States. He left the Klan formally to start the National Association for the Advancement of White People. That's part of the Aryan nations, that all of America could be white. And one of the groups that David Duke knew and associated with were a team of people that originally wanted to take over Dominica Island. Remember, I talked about that terrorism on many broadcasts going back to 1981, and David Duke worked with Robert Vesco, a person important with the Iran-Contra affair, links to many of the people, particularly those investigating or financing the entire Iran-Contra operations. And the group that were going to take over Dominica were to put swastikas and army memorabilia and renew Nazi artifacts and lifestyles in the Caribbean. So Mr. David Duke, who had already said he wanted to run for president, has Bo Gritz wanting to be his vice president. Well, the tape is up now. I was going to do more on the Knights of Klan and David Duke, but I think you get the essence of what I'm saying about this team. And though Bo Gritz wants to expose drugs coming into this country, he still is very much part of the far, far right establishment and always was. That is the conclusion of this tape. It's about to run out, so I must say goodbye to you now. I'll be back with you next week to continue with many, many stories and a lot more on George Bush.